Greetings and welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us at Space Cowboy Books Online. I'm your host, Jean-Paul, and this evening we are here with Ai Jiang for the release of A Palace Near the Wind from Titan Books. Thank you so much for being here. Nice to see some familiar names in the group there. We're going to have a reading and an interview, and if any time during the interview you should have questions, please do feel free to drop those in the chat, and we'll try to get to all of them. Ai Jiang is a Chinese-Canadian writer, winner of the Bram Stoker, Nebula, and Ignite Awards, and a Hugo, Astounding, Locus, and BSFA Award finalist, and an immigrant from Fujian, currently residing in Toronto, Ontario. Her works can be found in fantasy and science fiction, the dark, uncanny, the Master's Review, among others. And she was a recipient of the Odyssey Workshop's 2022 Fresh Voices Scholarship and the author of Linguin and I Am I. Tonight, she's going to be reading from A Palace Near the Wind. Thank you so much for being back on the program, Ai, and take it away.
Thank you so much again for having me, and thank you everyone for coming. So this is the opening from A Palace Near the Wind. Bridewell. Trailu blew on the white and blue rain blooms as she clutched tight the navy stems. The dozens of slender arms protruding from their tips held onto teardrop-like bulbs. Her breath scattered the seeds so they may travel and grow elsewhere. One ancient story passed down in Feng told of the floating seeds helping those who blew them to find what they were seeking. There was little doubt my sister and I were praying for the same thing, to find our sisters and mother. We denied the possibility of their death for the annuals they had spent, sight unseen, within the palace. Grandmother would have told us. We would have held a funeral. All we held now was our silence and uncertainty. Even with the sunlight beckoning the forest to stretch its limbs and drink its rains, the warmth was not comforting. It battered and scorched my body, igniting the pent-up anger and sorrow within. A sob welled at the thought of my 3 younger sisters and mother when they were still in Feng. Back then, it felt as though our home was in an eternal spring. At dusk, in the rain-bloom field, Yunshu, Heshi, Shanshu, and I offered whispers of our dreams of love, of age, of adventure. Mother always watched, settled under a nearby storm tree, with a gentle smile reaching her eyes. It had been 3 annuals since second youngest sister Shanshu married the king. She'd be 23 annuals if she was alive. She is, or so I told myself. Trillia was unaware of my sorrow as I shielded my face from her, not wanting my youngest sister to watch as I crumbled. I imagined the rain-blue droplets lifting into the sky with my own sapped tears. Would the seeds find them? Trelia's eyes were like earthy moons. The natural gods and the wind will guide them. A lie. I too would soon be married to the king. I couldn't tell her I would act as her seeking rain bloom. All she had to do was wait for my return. Lu Feng. Grandmother's voice drifted from behind. It is time. I patted Trelia's head, her dark needle threads soft against the rough bark of my skin, and nudged her towards a cluster of hollows making up our home in Feng. Reluctant at first, her shoulders then drooped before she trotted away. Grandmother and I waited until she disappeared into the storm tree's embrace. 2 individuals must settle the negotiation of bridewell. They must be close, yet not too close, to the soon-to-be married couple's families. This was the first time marriage negotiations were taking place in Feng. My mother's sister Shamu and Copper, the king's aunt, would meet to negotiate the terms of my marriage to the king. The palace grounds were forth again, growing ever closer to our home. Only through the marriages would there be a chance to halt, or at least delay, the relentless expansions. I followed grandmother away from the field towards the edge of Feng and waited for Copper to exit the palace. We stood, obscured by large storm tree leaves, gray, shifting, like a slice of dark sky and clouds contained within the naturally serrated edges. Driven by slivers of wind, the tree brewed small hurricanes and tornadoes, a flurry of branches and trunks intertwining. Yet only soft tickles graced our fingertips when we brushed the storm tree leaves aside, like collected dust, touchable clouds, soft tumbleweeds. The gates of the palace yawned like the opening of a freshly dug grave. Settled on top of a bulky and imposing traveler, Copper towered over both the palace guards, whose machines were half the height of hers. They flanked Copper both ahead and behind, adorned in pooling black cloaks with the hoods drawn up, hanging just before the lips. The controlled strides of the traveler's mechanical legs creaked metallically, resounding between the palace and Feng. Copper and the palace guards moved forth in a rhythm too steady on the travelers, with silver legs, feet, and talons resembling those of birds. The palace was too far, an hour away by wind, far less on the traveler, for the eyes and ears of those who lived within the palace, land wanderers. But the sound met us early, the same with sight. Even grandmother, ancient in her age, could see every detail of a single feather on a bird's wing several gusts of winds away. I heard land wanderers had no such capabilities. The walls extending skywards around the palace grazed the clouds. The palace itself seemed encased in a bone mold, rigid, still, dead. Few had seen past the walls. Along the bottom, there were more waiting tiles, stacked on top of uprooted trees and dead undergrowth, like feeble fingers, clutching, scraping, futile. If I had the power, if the wind ever allowed, though I knew the natural gods were never in favor of chaos, I would show the king what it was like to have his home threatened, to feel attacked, to be afraid, and I would mock his terror in silence. I will stop there.
Thank you so much for sharing that excerpt with us. Um, so, A Palace Near the Wind is, to my reading, a fantasy book. So you've now written horror books, science fiction, and fantasy. And I wondered, when do you decide to reach for which genre, depending on the type of story you want to tell, and which, if any, is your preference when writing?
So I often start with like an idea or a theme or a question, and I kind of let the story tell me which genre it wishes to be rather than me picking the genre before jumping into the story. So I don't think I have a very specific preference. But I always find it interesting because whichever book I most recently published, that is the label I get from my readers. So when I published Lincoln, people were like, "Oh, this is a new horror writer." When I published I Am I, people were like, "Oh, it's a new sci-fi writer." So then when Palace comes up, people are like, "Oh, a new fantasy writer." So I think for me, all these genres kind of serve a different like exploration purpose, if that makes sense. Like sci-fi for me serves as a vehicle for like social or societal commentary, whereas fantasy is more philosophical and like existential and exploration of the unknown. And then horror for me kind of is something more interior and psychological. And I try to use it to explore like fears and worries and concerns I have at more of a personal level.
And do you find that one is easier than the other?
I definitely think fantasy is the hardest because of how much world building is involved and how like much balancing is involved with it. And I feel like horror to me is easier because I really zoom in a lot on character interiorities and then I kind of forget about the rest of it.
And so with this new book, you've moved from publishing with independent presses to trad publishing. What's this process been like, and has this changed the way that you work in any way?
So we were kind of just talking about this earlier, right? I feel like in terms of like timelines, that is something that's definitely changed from like small press to a larger publisher because how many extra steps there are in the process. With small presses, it was just like you sign a contract, the release date might be like a year afterwards, right? But then with Titan and like when I moved into trad publishing, I had to go through my agent and then we had to go on submission. And then all of that added together might be like 2 or 3 years before the book actually comes out, right? So I was saying how this book was actually written between like 2021 and like the end of 2022, but it's not coming out until 2025. And so I feel like it's changed the way I write in that I'm trying to stockpile my ideas and try to write them as quickly as possible to get them into the pipeline as quickly as possible because I have no idea when they might be acquired, if ever, and when they might come out after they are acquired.
That sounds like it makes timelines a little trickier. Are there any things that are easier about the process for you?
I think because they have like with trap publishing, they feel like there's a much more robust marketing team and like sales team doing a lot of the back end stuff that I can't do personally, like reach out to big box stores like, Barnes and Nobles, Indigo, to try to get the books into those stores compared to some smaller presses they might not stock because they just can't afford to do like the same returns and things. So
That's an issue we could talk about for a whole hour, but we're gonna get back to the book. Um, in A Palace Near the Wind, the world of what I saw as the world of artifice is encroaching itself onto the natural world. Um, I wondered if you would consider this in a way a cli-fi book. Um, and what made you decide to have this be a major part of of the world building in the book?
So it's funny how many times the direction of this book has changed from the beginning to the end of it while I was writing. So at the beginning, I definitely intended this to be more of a sci-fi book with aspects of like solar punk and lunar punk and have it be a little more lighthearted than it actually ended up being because it took quite a dark turn as I was writing it. So, something I've always loved about fantasies in general is when they incorporate, like, the different five elements fire, water, air, etc. But in this case, I kind of wanted to have a magic system that essentially takes the form of renewable resources like water and wind without the other one.
That definitely comes across, and we're going to get much deeper into that a little later. Um, to me, this book was also about forced cultural changes, including as many immigrants have faced the changing of their given names. I wonder if you could elaborate on this theme and where you were coming from with that.
So, this will be quite a complicated answer or like a rambly answer, I guess, because I was thinking a lot about the different names we give natural things, the way we call mountains mountains. But then I also thought about, okay, but what if mountains can talk? Would they actually call themselves mountains? Things like that. But also how like in our language in general, um, there are certain words that exist in one language but don't exist in another language, or like certain words have very different meanings or hold very different weights in one language compared to another. So, one thing I've been thinking a lot about, not just when writing this book, but like writing all my other books, is that so like my hometown dialect is Fuzhouhua, and it is spoken and it is not written. So there are words where you won't be able to find like the Mandarin, like um, how do you say it? Like the letter form of it, right? Or like the character form of it. So one thing I've noticed is that sometimes to kind of express these Fujonese words, they will take Chinese characters that sound similar, put them together, and then the locals will know what it means, even though the characters are not like they do not mean the same thing as the actual word in Fuzhouhua.
That's completely fascinating. And when a word has no written form, and this is something that you're trying to convey to an English reading audience, how do you go about that?
difficultly. I think this is something that comes later in the second book, so I don't want to spoil too much of it because for the Wind people, they have their own wind language, right? So we have like the basically the anglicized versions of the names, but it will not sound the same to them if they say it in their own language. But because I'm writing in English, we can't really do much about that.
Yeah, that sounds very tricky. I've spoken to Chinese friends about untranslatable things. And one thing that just seemed so foreign and amazing to me was the idea of a sexy onomatopoeia, which was just something that could not happen in English in any way whatsoever. But very fascinating. Um, and sticking with names for a moment here, um, can you tell us a bit about the symbolism behind all of the medals you used for character names, specifically within the palace?
So I will not say too much about it because the middle names used in the palace come more into play in the second book, and it they kind of become crucial to how the plot unfolds, and I'll leave it at that. But as for the cultures, this kind of ties back to the sci-fi aspect of it all and like the renewable versus non-renewable resources and the way they are like depleted and manipulated and used to serve human aims is sometimes excessively rather than moderately and sometimes without being replenished.
And hopefully, I'm not digging too deep into the next book here. Um, but there was one passage in the book where I think there was a question of whether someone had actually remembered their birth name. And I wondered if you could just
Mm.
talk about the power of names in general in this way.
I so I feel like with names, this is something that's been very complicated growing up because I had tried to change my names a bunch of times growing up, and none of them ever stuck, whether it is because it did not really reflect my Chinese name, or my mom was like, "Oh, it doesn't really suit you." But then when we found something that was more suitable, they're like, "Oh no, but it's too common." Um, so for me, I think in Palace, like in a Palace Near the Wind, I tried to explore the importance of names and its connection to identity, and how giving it up is, in essence, almost sacrificing a piece of yourself.
That definitely comes across in here. And continuing on that theme, something that you touched on a little bit earlier, the different cultures in this book share many attributes in common with the elements: wood, water, wind, metal, etc. And I wondered if you could speak about why you chose to use the elements in this way as aspects of these different cultures that you've created, because there's a rich wealth, a variety of cultures in this book.
I think I accidentally answered this question with the previous question. But yeah, so it kind of ties to like, the idea of renewable resources. And I kind of wanted to build cultures around those and see. I cannot say too much about it because it comes more to play in the next book. But we will see how these cultures kind of reflect the way humanity has treated these resources, but through almost like a anthropomorphized version of them.
God, now we're like, I'm dying to read this second book. We'll talk a little bit about that coming up soon. Here's a question from Eliane in the audience. It's not quite a question, but she also loved the horror inherent in the colliding of cultures, especially with food and the skins. She'd love to hear more about that.
So, so we know that the windwalkers have like bark-like skin, and we know that the water shifters have basically water bodies. And something I wanted to explore with that is just how like the build, like how do you say, like the makeup of these two cultures' bodies, and kind of like the texture of their bodies compared to human bodies and our kind of makeup and how different it is and how jarring it feels. Like what feels very, soothing to humans, let's say, our bare feet on a marble floor. When we think about it, it's something very familiar, right? We wake up in the morning, sometimes we don't wear slippers, we step on the floor. But to a being that is not familiar with these human constructed things, there is something very horrific about it, right? Something similar to like, let's say we are expecting to drink water, but suddenly it's something very sour. The first thing our brain kind of thinks of is this poisoned? And what have I drank, right? Um, and I kind of wanted to build on that in this book through like, the different ways the windwalkers experience human things.
And that also makes me think about, I don't want to give too many spoilers for those that haven't read the book yet, but with the bark skin and at one point talking about manipulating the skin, by being sanded down and just what does that mean for identity to go through such a drastic change that's almost a shunning of where one comes from. Could you speak about that?
So that I feel like it is very much drawn on like the experience of me when I first came to Canada, right? Like, the need to simulate when I was younger, I was like in the ESL program, English as a second language. And I had an accent. And for the longest time, I was trying to shed the accent because it was something that people kept mentioning as like a difference, And there was always a need to kind of be similar to everyone else, right? Have like a lighter skin. So then I would go on Google and be like, how do I make my skin look lighter? And this was when I was in like third grade. It's a wild thing, what immigration sometimes does to you. So when I was thinking about the simulation of, the windwalkers to like humanity and like that is kind of how the sanding down of the bark came about.
That's really rough. No pun intended. And it almost I felt like it almost moved into body horror in that section of the book. Um, that need to assimilate so greatly. And very difficult. And it that brings me to my next question, which is something that I found really rich throughout the book. This contrast between rough skin, between smooth skin, and the book is just filled with contrast. From wooden, vibrant forest and the cultures that they produce to the palace, which is made of bone, which to me sort of symbolized the death of nature through the march of so-called progress. As well as contrast between an ever-changing present and a love for tradition in the past, and the way you alternated between the two, almost within from paragraph to paragraph. Um, and I wondered if you could tell us a bit about using contrast as storytelling devices, and maybe get a little bit into the Palace of Bone with bone floors, because again, this is another thing that almost took me from the fantasy world you created into something that was in the realm of horror.
So I love juxtaposition to a fault. So I wanted to kind of use it to explore the idea of culture shock and stepping out of one's world in this book in particular. And for our narrator, the cycle of life and death is something that is more organic and natural, right? Like in her world, things die, they return to the earth. They are not reutilized in the way that it has been by the humans in this world specifically. Um, because perhaps like in this world how we've evolved, innovate, or invent tools or terraform the world in a smaller scale sense. I wanted to make the palace basically a place that is both jarring to the reader as it is to our narrator, something that might emphasize the idea of access and consumption in the way that is more glaring than having, let's say, the pallets being made of bricks, right, or of metal, which we feel much more comfortable and familiar with as readers. But if it's made out of bone, it's not something we traditionally use, right, in the building of our homes. It makes us feel less safe, should we say. Yeah.
And that also makes me think of something that I found interesting and subtle in the book was the nature of comfort, um, and how that changes and the differences from when we where we are and the type of environment we grow up in. For instance, your protagonist doesn't want to sleep in the bed and is more comfortable in a nest of wood chips, and I found that very beautiful. But then also how we as people acclimate to differences in comfort as we move on.
So, yeah, so that's kind of what I also wanted to explore in the book and how, like, no matter how comfortable and familiar we are with like a certain surrounding, and no matter how jarring we find moving into a different environment, there is something that is part of our nature that will kind of try to acclimate, right? And almost to the point, like if we know there is no other choice but to acclimate, slowly we rewire ourselves to almost find comfort in the unfamiliar, to try to find the allure in what originally we found jarring, if that makes sense. I won't, I'm trying to not to spoil too much of it in case no one has read it yet.
Yeah, it's tricky to get into a book without spoiling it for those that haven't read it. But there's a link. I'm just dropping a link in the chat here, and it'll be below the video on YouTube for anyone that wants to read the book. I highly recommend it. And this is like a one or two sitting read. You're gonna burn through it and wish that the next one was coming sooner. Um, uh, while we're on that, real quick, I do want to get back into the book, but I understand that A Place Near the Wind is going to have a sequel, A River from the Sky, and this is going to be coming soon from Titan Books. When can we expect this? And can you maybe give us a little taste of what's to come and what to expect from this book? Of course, without spoiling it.
So it is coming out 2026 April. So same month, just a year later. And it's funny because there were so many podcasts and interviews I did where they were asking about A River from the Sky and what to expect. And that was before I had written it. Because I had written it literally a month ago, as we were talking about earlier. And so now I can give a slightly better description, I hope. But so, A River from the Sky, essentially, I want to explore kind of information and misinformation spread, and how the more information you have, the better choices, like the more informed choices you can make. But at the same time, the easier it is for you to get the wrong information. And I also wanted through it to explore discovering our own truth and kind of continue the questioning of the knowledge we believe ourselves to know, and kind of the more moral grayness of industry, of innovation and invention and discovery, and kind of the allure of it all, and the reconciliation between progress and the change in the natural world. Because for A Palace Near the Wind, it is very much from a more naive and one-sided point of view from the narrator, whereas A River from the Sky is from the other side of the wall, where we have a much clearer picture of what this whole world is about.
And how did that change from what you had initially thought that the book might be about when you were talking about it before?
So it is kind of similar, but I feel like whenever I write books, I discover more things about the book as I'm writing it, or something that is contradictory to what I was originally trying to explore, if that makes sense. So I think what I had originally intended for the other side of the book is to have a very, very contrasting rather than a more balanced point of view of like industry being very great. So you have like the two very juxtaposing sides. But then as I was writing, I took more of a morally gray uh, path to the narrative.
I often find when I'm writing books that when I'm finished and I go back and read, I find that there are emergent themes that I wasn't really considering as I was writing it. This happens to me almost every time I write a book. I wonder if this happens to you when you write, and if there were any themes that you found coming out of the book that you didn't see initially.
I feel like I will have to think a long time about this answer. Because as we were speaking about earlier, because of how long the lead time is from the moment we write the book and from the moment it comes out, sometimes you forget the initial intention you had for the book until you really sit down and think about it for a long time, as you would as like a new reader going back into the book. But because I'm like also no longer the person I was when I wrote the book, it also feels very different.
And this is your third novella published. I wonder if you're starting to see patterns in your body of work as it develops.
I think like a sense of placelessness and homelessness, identity, immigration. I feel like no matter what the overarching theme is, they will always be thread lines that are underlaying in all my narratives.
One thing I've noticed in all of your books is, and this book is certainly no exception, a very complicated family structure. The family dynamics within A Palace Near the Wind are tricky, and of course tricky to talk about without spoilers as well. But very very complicated, almost operatic. And I know we talked about it before when you run the program. And I know that there is some degree of intentionality there. But is this something that you set out to explore in your books? And where has it taken you? Because it's very different from one book to the other.
I so with A Palace Near the Wind specifically, I wasn't setting out to explore such a complicated family tree. But with Lincoln, definitely. I think with A Palace Near the Wind, it because it's so focused with the main character on tradition and duty and familial kind of responsibilities, it ultimately became a story where the family relationships are very messy and complicated, and kind of how the narrator has to navigate that while kind of accepting new information that contradicts what she has always been taught and what she has always known.
That was very skillful how you avoided spoilers on that one. I wasn't sure how it was going to be
We
possible.
tried our best.
Here's a question from JS in the audience. I'm curious about the editorial process of the respective books, Palace versus River, especially with this discussion around varying lead times.
so so with A Palace Near the Wind, it had originally started out as like five chapters I had worked on in a very brief workshop. So it was touched by like seven different writers during that workshop, including the workshop lead, and then I had edited based on their feedback, and then I had later expanded it as a part of my thesis for my master's program later on. So then my supervisor had read like the first 15,000 words. And then after that, it went to my agent who read the whole thing, about 25,000 words. And we went through about eight drafts, I believe, before it went out on submission. And and then we went through like one editorial draft for was it with my editor at Titan before your final form now. But with A River from the Sky, I had written it in about 2 weeks or so, but I had been thinking about it for the last 2 years. So actual, thinking time 2 years, actual writing time though 2 weeks. But then it went through like one beta reader, went directly to my editor. So it will be the most authentic chaos you will read from me. So we will see.
This is a bit of a weird question, and but as an editor myself, I wonder, especially when a book goes through so many various stages and different hands on it, and every editor has different style of approach. Um, have you found, do you ever feel that there's something that's lost in what you want to be in the book?
I think definitely because some editors will edit based on structure and plot, not necessarily intention and content, if that makes sense. And I feel like as I was trying to shape the book into a very specific structure that was requested of me, some of what I had originally intended for the book to be about and kind of serve as a metaphor of had been lost. Um, I had intended for it to be a standalone, something that moved a lot slower, but it turned out to be a duology. So we are here.
And when you say you intended something slower, can you talk a little bit about pacing? And I found that the pacing of this book was different than the other works of yours that I've read. There was even some passive voicing that I found surprising. And you're like awesome about breaking the rules and getting away with it. Somehow you do that every time. Um, but I wonder if you could talk about pacing and um, your intention behind a slower, maybe perhaps more ruminative work.
I feel like I think the best way to describe a lot of my works when I'm writing is that it is an essay in disguise. I feel like I sometimes approach writing books as though I am writing an essay trying to answer a question that I've wanted to answer for a very long time. So whenever I write, I think very little about the overall structure, especially, with like traditional three acts, things like that. So when I'm writing, it is very intuitive. And when I am asked to kind of fit my writing into a specific structure, I start getting very muddled.
And is that something you feel that you can buck against? I mean, that you have the power to tell the story your way, or is this more of a recovering academic scenario?
I I don't know, actually. I feel like I am just trying to write stories how I want to write them, but if the people who are paying me money want them a different way, I kind of have to give a little more leeway, if that makes sense. I feel like something I've been thinking a lot about is like, having my books be more commercial versus retaining artistic integrity. And especially moving into traditional publishing, it has been a bit of a push and pull, um, compared to, I think, smaller presses that allow you to experiment a bit more and have more like creative freedom, if that makes sense.
And how does that issue differ when working with short fiction markets versus book length manuscript?
I feel like with short fiction markets, they are a lot more flexible in how experimental and how artistic you can get with your work. Like, because it is in such a short form too, it is much easier to try something new, to be bold and take risks, and also not feel like, how should I say this? I think because a lot of traditional publishers are looking at like broad audience sales, they are more risk averse compared to short fiction markets.
And do you think that you'll continue working with independent presses for those reasons to give you a little more freedom on the creative side?
I feel like it will depend on the project, I think. I am very much the type who's like very stubborn-minded and will try to shoehorn my way into traditional publishing with my weird things.
I think it can be done. If anyone's gonna do it, I think you can pull it off. So switching gears a little bit here. Last time you were on the program, we talked a little bit about a novel that you've been working on, inspired by Chinese opera, which just perked my ears up right away because I've watched some Chinese opera. I found I don't like comedies, but I do like the dramas. And this is just so intriguing to me how this could be an influence on a novel. How's that coming along? And I wonder if you could possibly share a little bit about this story with us.
So this book actually got picked up. So it is my debut novel coming out with Titan Books next year in September, titled An Empire Above Opera, which is set on a drowning continent of royal siblings striving to survive in the climate of murder and corruption. That is like the brief blurb. And this book is essentially inspired by like the Fuzhonese opera cassettes my grandmother used to listen to when I was younger. And this book is kind of about stories manipulated and lost, remembered and hidden, of rebellion and reconciliation of like fallen legacies and dynasties. And it draws on traditions of bianlian, which is face changing and an element of Sichuan opera, as well as drawing elements of Peking opera and Min opera. The latter is specific to my home province in Fujian. But yeah, so this book draws a lot on like stories being told, stories being changed, and how it affects both individual and societal identities.
This doesn't sound like a traditional Western story that publishers would expect. So maybe you've already pulled off what we were talking about. Um, I know probably most of my experiences with Peking opera and martial arts is a part of the opera, which is just amazing to me. It's like a higher art form than ballet. Is that something that comes into the story as well?
Sorry, could you repeat that again?
The inclusion of martial arts in Peking opera, which sort of takes it to this next level above ballet, and in my opinion, is a high art. Is this something that comes into play in the story as well?
So, not in the first novel, but it will come into play in the standalone prequel. So, it was sold as a two-book deal, but then I didn't want to write a sequel because I didn't want to do that again. So it's a standalone, and then we will have a standalone prequel that will explore the more martial arts side of Chinese opera in general.
No, you are going to keep me busy reading next year. Amazing. Shifting gears again. So this year, you've also had an incredible milestone. For the first time ever, there will be a Hugo Award for poetry, and you're one of the finalists. Congratulations. Uh,
Thank you.
what's this experience been like so far for you? Obviously, it's not happened yet. I hope to see you at Worldcon if America's not too weird. Um, and more specifically, how does working as a poet inform your writing of fiction?
So I find that whenever I receive a nomination, I'm often in awe because of the thought that my work has stayed with enough readers and that it is the first thing that comes through their mind when they're submitting their nominations. And for that, I will forever be grateful. It's, I don't know, it's a weird thing. It's like you write things because you want people to read it, but then you get very surprised when people actually read it. And as for how poetry informs my fiction, I think because I write poetry, I find that at time, like the line level in fiction, I tend towards imagery and metaphor a lot, particularly when it comes to short fiction. I'll like rewrite lines until I'm satisfied with the cadence and rhythm, as well as what information it reveals, both at the surface level and also between the lines before I move on. But I've been finding it very difficult to do in long form just because of how dense the writing might become and how difficult it is to sustain that density over 60 to 80,000 words.
And back for a second to your novel inspired by opera, how important was prosody and the musicality of language in writing that, since it's basically inspired by a form of music?
So I didn't focus so much on musicality in general, but more so the depictions of performance and the metaphor that performance as a general serves in the novel.
My God, I can't wait to read this. Please send me an arc and come back on the program when that comes out.
I will.
Um, So lastly, we've talked a lot about these upcoming projects, but what are you currently writing and working on, and what's coming up next for you?
So I just finished in a rather experimental book about two individuals connected by fate, yet missing each other in every lifetime they've ever lived, whether willingly or unwillingly. And the story is kind of about how they meet again. I'll leave it there without spoiling more. But it is the first time I'm trying like a nested story structure, so I'm very excited about it, but I'm also not sure if it really works. It's with the betas now. One of y'all are here. Hello. But next, I'll be finally working on the novelization of my short story, Give Me English, and hope to return to the realm of horror as well with a novella idea in mind. There will be houses involved and skin involved, and I will just leave it at that. But next year, we have a River from the Sky coming in April, and then An Empire Above Opera in September.
You have been very busy these last couple of years, and I'm so happy that it's been well received. Wonderful books. A Palace Near the Wind from Titan Books. Links in the chat. If you're watching on YouTube, it's down below. Go out and get this. It's an amazing book. Thank you so much, I, for joining us on the show again. Thank you to our audience for being here. And hope to see you soon.
Thank you so much again for having me and everyone for coming.